Hi, this is Julie, and in this presentation, I want to talk about how we can write menus in C++ code and how we can use the switch statement. So, what is a menu? Just like if we're at a restaurant, a menu is a list of choices for a user to select from. And after we display the list of choices, we're going to get the user's selection, and then we can either use an if-else-if ladder or a switch statement to process the selection. So let's take a look at how this operates. First thing I'm going to do is display the list of choices to the user. And I'm often going to put either a letter or a number by each choice to label it. That way the user can enter the letter or the number to indicate their selection. I'll then get the selection from the user using a cn statement, and then I'm going to test or evaluate their selection. If they made a valid selection, then I'll execute the associated code. Or if they made an invalid selection, I can do some sort of error processing. Once I have finished testing the user's selection and either executing code or showing error processing, then I can redisplay the list again so that they can make an additional option. And if I'm going to do something like this, this is where I would use a loop. Now today for this discussion, I'm not going to talk about loops. I'm just going to focus on how do we display the menu options and how do we evaluate them. So let's look at an example of a dessert menu. Here I'm going to display some choices for a user to choose from for a dessert. I'm going to begin by just displaying the menu items. Pick a dessert, and I have three options here labeled A, B, and C for cookies, brownies, or I'm on a diet. After I display the menu, I'm going to use the cn statement to get their choice from the console window and save their selection in the variable choice. And in this example, choice is a char data type. Now, once I have the choice from the user, I'm going to have to decide what to do with it. And I can use either the if-else-if ladder or a switch statement to evaluate it. So let's start first with the if-else-if ladder because we've seen if-else-if statements with other things. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a series of if and else-if statements, one per option, to test the selection. So here, the first thing I'm going to look at is, did the user enter an A? So if choice equal A, then I'm going to display cookies. Else, if their choice was a B, then I'm going to display brownies. Else, if their choice was a C, I'm on a diet, then I'm going to display carrots. And if I had more options, I could continue to string additional else-if statements for every possible choice on my menu. But sometimes a user might not enter one of the valid options, and I need to have some way to handle that situation. So I'm going to use what's called a trailing else. And this else looks different from the others because I don't have an if after it. So in other words, if I didn't match the three other conditions, this last else statement is going to capture anything else they possibly entered. And for this particular menu, that means that they did not choose a valid option. So I'm going to display invalid selection. So with these if-else-if statements, I have an if for each of the possible valid options, followed by some code that I want to execute for it. And then at the very end, I have an else without an if to catch all other possible entries. So that's how I can evaluate a menu with if, else, if statements. The other kind of statement I want to show you today is called a switch statement. So let's see the same menu evaluation with a switch. Again, I'm going to test the selection, but this time I am going to begin with the word switch. It's a reserved word because it's a special control structure for C++. And in parentheses, I'm going to list the variable name. In our case, this is named choice. So I put the variable name in the parentheses, and then everything that follows is going to be inside a code block inside the curly braces. Now, just like with the if, else, if statement, I need to have a situation for each of the possible valid options. So first, I'm going to start with the situation where the user chose the letter A for cookies. This statement here is going to do the same thing as the if choice equal A, cout cookies, but it's arranged a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do for each valid option is I'm going to have a special reserved word case, and then I'm going to list one of the possible valid options. In this case, the first one was a capital A. Choice is a char data type, so I'm going to put the letter A in single quotes, followed by a colon. And if the user chose an A, I would match this case statement and then display cookies. And I would then continue to execute any other lines of code that followed this case statement. So here I have cout cookies, and then I have another statement here, break. And this is another special statement that's basically going to say, all right, I've finished executing this case. I'm completely finished with the switch statement. Get out of the switch statement and go on to the next line of code. The next possibility, B, is going to work the same way. I'm going to say case with the capital B in single quotes because choice is a character data type, followed by a colon. This time I'm going to display brownies, and once again I'm finished with this switch statement, so I'm going to say break and get completely out of the switch statement. Case C also works the same way. I have the literal C in single quotes. I have the cout statement that I want to execute, followed by a break. And those are the three valid options that I had displayed on my menu. Now in the if, else, if statement, we had a trailing else to handle situations where the user did not enter an A, B, or a C. And I want to do something similar here in my switch statement. I don't have something called a trailing else, but instead I have a special reserved word called default. And I'm just going to put the word default by itself, followed by a colon, and it's going to do the same exact thing. It's going to catch all other conditions that had not already matched a case statement, and then I can display invalid selection. So if I were to write my program where I displayed the menu, I could use either that if, else, if ladder with all of the cases, all of the options in there with an if statement for each valid option and a trailing else, or I could use this switch control structure here with the three case statements and the default, and they're going to execute identically. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into how switch works, because we're already familiar with if, else, if, but let's look at switch. What I first want to look at a little more is the expression where I'm looking at my variable. My switch control structure is going to begin again with the word switch, and then in parentheses I'm going to put a variable name. And what this is really doing is I'm going to use that variable that's in the parentheses, and now I'm going to compare it to a series of constants. So if I have a char data type for character data, I'm going to compare choice to a character literal that's in single quotes, like case, single quote, a single quote, followed by a colon. I don't have to use character data. I could use integer data. And if I did, in this case, I would also compare choice to a literal, but this time it would be an integer literal. And with an integer literal, we don't use single quotes, double quotes, or anything like that. We're just going to say case followed by the number that applies to that particular option, and then the colon. So whether I'm using character data or integer data, I'm going to compare the variable that's in the parentheses after switch to a series of literals in each case statement. And so, however many options I have, I'm going to have a case statement for each of the valid options. After the case statements, again, I can put a default for none of the above, or basically the user didn't choose one of the valid options. And this is an optional thing. I'm not required to put that in switch, but I often will want to so that I can capture any type of invalid data. And then the other big thing is the break statement. And the break statement is something that if I'm not careful, I might leave it out and I might not get the results that I want. I might leave it out and not get the results. So if my program sees the word break when it's executing, the program's going to completely get out of the switch statement and go on to the next thing after switch. And that's usually what I'm going to want to do. And we say that that prevents the code from falling through to the next option. And what do I mean by falling through? This is not a problem we have with if, else, if. But it is something we can see with the switch statement. And let me show you an example of that. Here's another switch statement for the same menu of cookies, brownies, and I'm on a diet. This time I've left out the break statements. So after each case statement, I just have a single cout statement. And what's going to happen is, as soon as I match on one of these case statements, I'm going to execute every line of code from that point on until the very end of the switch statement. So if the user were to enter an A, we would match on the first case statement. I would then display cookies, but I would also keep on going, and I would display brownies and carrots. This may not be what I want to do. So this is an easy mistake to make. And if I don't want to print multiple options, I need to remember to put a break statement at the end of each case. And sometimes this error can be a little hard to find because if I'm testing the program and I enter a C, when the program executes, it's going to first look at the case of A. That doesn't match. Then the case of B. That won't match. And then finally it'll hit the case of C. That matches, and it prints carrots and no others. So it's going to look like it's working. But in effect, it really isn't, because if I were to select either A or B, I would see some additional options that I didn't want. And if I wanted to eat cookies, I certainly am not going to be interested in carrots. So let's do a comparison now between switch and if-else-if. Both of these control structures are going to test for a series of conditions. And either of these can compare a variable to a single literal. So here I'm looking at an integer variable age, and I want to see if somebody is 21 years old. With the if statement, I can say if age equal 21, that's only going to be true when the age is exactly 21. Or I can use a switch statement where I'm going to evaluate the value of the variable age. And if I have case 21 colon, that's going to be true if the age was exactly 21. So both of these are going to do the same thing. So those are how these two control structures are similar. But if I was interested in comparing age to a range of values, I cannot do that with a switch statement. I have to use an if-else-if statement. So here in the case where I'm going to compare age to 21, but this time I want to know, is this person 21 or older? Meaning, is their age greater than or equal to 21? I cannot do that with a switch statement. I have to use if-else-if. Also, we just talked about the fall-through issue with the switch statement. If I'm working with if-else-if, I'm only going to execute the code for exactly one case. I don't have a situation where I'm going to fall through to other cases. So those are the two ways the if-else-if is going to be different from the switch statement and how they execute. So now let's sum up what we talked about here. We talked about how we could display a menu of options, and then how do we evaluate the options. So what statements do work well with menus? Well, we just looked at two different statements. We looked at the switch statement as well as the if-else-if statement or control structure. What statement would I want to use in a switch if I want to exit the switch after I execute case statements? So in other words, I am in a switch control structure, I match on one of the cases, I execute the lines of code, and now I'm finished. How do I exit the switch statement? That's going to be with the break statement. And then, how can we handle invalid selections? Users don't always follow instructions. They may enter a selection that's not one of the valid options. So what can we do? Well, if we're using an if-else-if control structure, we can use a trailing else to catch all other conditions. Or if we're working with the switch control structure, we can use default to catch all other options as well. So for menus, either switch or if-else-if both work well. They both do the same thing. There's a few cases where if-else-if can do things switch can't, such as matching on ranges of data. And if-else-if does not have an issue with fall-through logic like the switch statement does.